All right, AP Bio, we're going to do this in about 20 minutes, and you can divide this up in about 3 sessions if you want. This little guy we're looking at here is a hellbender or a mud puppy, and he basically has gone through paedomorphosis where he keeps the gills that he would have had as a juvenile into adulthood to increase his ability to exchange oxygen and CO2. Because those two gases in particular are done completely by diffusion, but the problem is diffusion only happens over small distances. So if you want to know a principle of this chapter, that is it. And we have to overcome that if we're going to make a large creature. With small creatures like planaria and flatworms, they have flame cells, those little orange looking things on their edge of their body, where they push out waste like CO2, and diffusion just happens straight through their bodies because they're only about 3, 4, or 5 cells thick. So they don't need a circulatory or respiratory system, which go hand in hand. So in smaller thin animals, they can just deal with the environment directly around them. But if you're going to make large creatures where their cells don't have direct contact with the environment, you have got to come up with a system both to pull in O2 and get rid of CO2, and then to transport it throughout the body. So respiration and circulation go hand in hand. This slide got cut off. It actually asks, why is a three-chambered heart with incomplete septa actually an advantage to an amphibian? I'll make a pod out of that, but a septa is a separation, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. So you have two types of circulation for organisms. It's open versus closed. An open circulation system is like arthropods, bugs. They just pump hemolymph around their body, where we have, like that earthworm, a closed circulatory system where we enclose it in a circuit inside tubes and pressurize it. So in our closed circulatory system, we have veins and arteries. Arteries are away, veins are towards, but blood flows in one direction and one way throughout our system. So one of the things you need to keep straight, like what I just said, is arteries are away, and then veins go back to the heart. And what you have in that blue and red in the middle are little bitty capillaries. They're 1 to 2 cells thick. This is where diffusion happens, not in arteries or in veins, but in capillaries. And once diffusion takes place, then we can transport. So we have 2 chambers. We have an atrium, which receives blood, a small little pump, and it pumps it into a ventricle, which is a large muscular pump. And we'll talk about that. I wish I were with me. We would get the stethoscopes out and listen to that sound in our heart. But for now, we'll just get through this. So fish basically have a 2-chambered heart where they just receive and pump, and the blood has to flow through one round system. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, and that incomplete septa separation like wall allows a frog to shut off the blood to its lungs and just breathe through its skin, where mammals and birds have a 4-chambered heart. So that 3-chambered heart with incomplete septa is not a poor heart. It's actually an adaptation by amphibians where if they're not using their lungs, they'll just shut them down. So we are completely separated in a 4-chambered heart. Theirs is due to their lifestyle. So the question that I'll make another pod out of is, why would birds and mammals want to keep their heart completely separate? I want you to think about the fact of their energy intake, warm-bloodedness. 90% of our calories go to heat, and we need to make sure we have the most efficient. We don't mix low O2 and high O2 blood. So explore that in your chapter. This is a picture of the heart of a blue whale. It's as large as a Volkswagen Bug. But we are going to focus on this, and in your book, I want you to pay attention to the numbered diagram of the circulatory system, and I want you to be able to walk through those numbers. So go through your book, focus on that, and I'll also make a pod out of a diagram that looks just like this, but with no labels, and I want you to be able to walk me through the process. So what you can see is the left side of the heart pumps oxygen-rich blood, and the right side receives oxygen-poor blood. So oxygen-rich in red, oxygen-poor in blue, received on the right side, pumped out on the left side. So blood flow begins in the right ventricle. It's poor low O2 blood, and it receives it in the right atria, goes to the right ventricle, and that pumps it out to the lungs, where they load the O2 and unload CO2, and then that red oxygen-rich blood will then flow out into the left atrium, out of the left ventricle to the rest of the body. And this is what we call the circuit, basically. We have two circuits. It makes like a figure eight. And so into the right, low O2, out the left, high O2. The low O2 blood goes to the lungs, which should make sense to you, and the high O2 blood goes to the body. And so here is the wording of the anatomy where we receive blood from the superior vena cava, from basically the upper body, and it goes into the right atrium, and then we also receive it from the inferior vena cava from the lower body, goes into the right atrium together, and then that blood will go to the lungs. When that heart relaxes, it fills with blood, and when it contracts, it squeezes. And so the relaxing and the squeezing, the sequence of pumping and filling, is what you know of as the cardiac cycle. So the atria are much smaller, which you'll see. They have very thin walls. Their only job is to receive blood. They're collection chambers. And when they do contract, they just squeeze that blood into the ventricle, which, yes, it's larger overall, but it has a much more thicker muscle layer, which you're about to see. And when it contracts, that's what you really feel as a heartbeat, because they have to pressurize that blood, 120/80 to be exact, to get it out to the rest of the body. And so every time your heart pumps per minute, that is what you consider your cardiac output, how many liters of blood you can pump in 1 minute. So this is the anatomy of the heart. Pay attention to the valves. But as we get into this is the cardiac cycle, where blood enters on the right side, low O2, it's blue, right atria, it contracts, goes into the right ventricle, it squeezes, right? But the ventricles contract at the same time, so we'll talk about it in a minute, but you just hear a lub-dub sound. So the lub are the atria and the dub are the ventricles. This all happens in about half a second. Average human heart rate is about 1 beat per second, 60 beats per minute. Some of you, if you're high stressed or younger, you'll have higher than that. If you're athletes, you'll have lower than that, but the average is about 60. If you were with me and we had those stethoscopes, we'll put them in our ears, put them on someone's chest, back, and listen to that lub-dub sound. That is atrioventricle, atrioventricle, atrioventricle. If you hear a vibration, that's known as a heart murmur, that has to do with one of those valves that's letting some of that blood back in. It goes in reverse, and it creates a vibration. And sometimes that's developmental, and it goes away. Another thing we could do is put some electrodes on you, and you could have seen it on my iPad if we were together, and you can see this electric discharge of the heart. Now the heart actually controls itself. The brain doesn't control the heart. The brain talks to the heart through the SA node, the pacemaker. But the heart runs its own show. The brain will just communicate with it that it needs more O2 or less O2, and the heart will respond by slowing down or speeding up. So if people need a pacemaker, that's what's happened. They have had some damage done to their muscles and nerves there in the heart, and they have to have an external source kind of pace them through it. But you can actually see and trace the electrical signals that run through the heart to keep it at its involuntary rhythm, I guess. You don't have to think about controlling your own heartbeat. When people have heart attacks and they have damaged muscle and damaged nerves, and that's what makes the heartbeat sometimes weaker, and they have to have external help. And so the electrical impulse spreads all at once. There's multinucleated muscle cells in the heart because coordination is really, really important. So one of the things we could do on my iPad, again, is measure your heartbeat and look for any weird rhythms, peaks that are close to each other, too far apart, too fast, too high, too low. We'll talk about how this is regulated chemically with potassium and sodium when we talk about the nervous system, but this is easy to see, and this is a diagnostic tool. So another question that I'll put on a pod that I'm curious about is explain why resting heart rate decreases after months of cardio training, but total cardiac output remains the same. In other words, why do athletes have lower heart rates but still pump the same amount of volume of blood as you do? What has happened to the heart? All right, so I want you to think about that as a muscle. So whenever you get to capillaries, pressure goes way down because they're really, really tiny. And if you have a high blood pressure on a little bitty tiny vessel, that will burst it. If you want to know what this is like, just go get a garden hose and put your thumb over the end of the hose. Just by closing the opening, you can force higher pressure out of the same volume. And so blood pressure is really important, especially to older folks, but you have to watch it because if it gets too high, it can damage those small little capillaries. And if you can get an aneurysm, and it causes a lot of problems, not just with diffusion, but with actual structure. But it's always systolic over diastolic. Our average heart rate is 120 over 80. I mean, the average blood pressure is 120 over 80. I wish you were in lab with me. We would take your blood pressure maybe on a Friday or a Monday, and you would see changes. And you have changes throughout the day, depending on if you eat, if you're sleepy, and what's going on in class. The chemical composition of blood is not just red water. I mean, water is part of it, but there are a lot of solid particles in it, like different types of cell types and platelets. 45% is solid, where 55% is more liquid or thick liquid, almost like egg albumin, the egg whites. So to let this happen, you have to have a good respiratory exchange system. And so there's a bristle worm there that has external gills on its body to increase its surface area. Starfish do the same thing with their limbs around a central axis to increase exchange rate, surface area. And so one of the reasons animals came out onto land is that O2 is plentiful in air, and air is a thin medium. And so it's easy to get oxygen, where O2 in the water is much more difficult to get. It's dissolved at a lower percentage rate, and water is obviously thicker to get. And so marine creatures are super efficient about getting gas exchange done. It all takes place by diffusion, and respiratory surfaces have to be moist and thin. So gills, for example, but an amphibian's skin is thin and a large surface area, and our lungs have to be moist and they have a large surface area as well. Gills are about 85% efficient. Our lungs are only about 25% efficient. If you're a long distance runner and you had the same efficiency as a fish in your lungs, you could basically have a conversation while doing a marathon. It would be absolutely amazing. Fish use a countercurrent exchange system where the flow of water goes one way and the flow of blood inside the gill tissue goes the opposite way. And that kind of increases the rate of collision, if you will, between O2 and CO2, between the water and their blood. And that's how they're so efficient at extracting oxygen. Insects with their open circulatory system also have a kind of an open respiratory system with their tracheal system. We borrowed this invention and stuck it in our throat and in our lungs, basically. But it's just a set of rings that hold a pipe open. And insects basically ventilate their bodies. They're moving their bodies. And so if you ever watch a grasshopper move its abdomen back and forth, it's breathing. One of the cool things about insects and O2 is their size is directly proportional to O2 diffusion rates. So back in the day when O2 oxygen levels, were 30-40%, you would get dragonflies as big as a hawk. And so reptiles and mammals don't work that way, but arthropods do. And so you get a little picture of a fossil there of a dragonfly wing compared to a modern dragonfly. Now, lungs are a neat invention because you can have the same volume in the body, but if you do multiple infolding on the inside, kind of like the bristle worm on the outside with the bristles sticking out, well, we did that on the inside, and so we have all these pockets. So it's not just a hollow sac. It's filled with a bunch of folds and balloons, and which you'll see. And so we have a branching balloon infolded system. And the way we talk about breathing is we talk about ventilating our lungs. If I had you in ninth grade, or if we were together now, we would dissect a frog, cut open its lung, and inside you would see the lungs look more like a sponge then they do like a hollow sac. It's amazing, and this is what makes pneumonia so dangerous. So the pharynx is where it comes into your mouth. The larynx is where your voice box is. Your trachea is your windpipe. And then after that, you get two bronchi, right and left. Bronchioles, little branches, and then alveoli, the little sacs. And inside the little sacs are little hairs and mucus that are lined with mucus and water, and they always beat up. And so sometimes you go to clear that out. And so breathing is known as ventilation, and so we just move air in and out. Now, different creatures do it differently. So amphibians will use positive pressure breathing, which basically means they gulp or swallow their air. You'll watch a frog do this. He'll push down his eyes and push the air into his lungs. Birds have 8 or 9 different air sacs where it goes into a posterior air sac on inhalation. And then on exhalation, it goes into the lungs and into the anterior air sacs, while the posterior air sacs fill again. So birds receive oxygen on the inhale and the exhale. Have fun trying to figure that one out and breathe like a bird. But they are fascinating and really efficient for land vertebrates and how they breathe. You can ignore this picture with Darth Vader. If we were in class, we would go through just some Q&A in your book, and we would be getting ready for a lab. So maybe someday I'll be back with you here this year. I don't know. So as I said, mammals ventilate. Just like you would open up your windows to your house and let air flow through, we open up our mouth and we let air flow into. We do this by contracting our diaphragm muscle, which runs below our rib cage. If you've ever been out of shape and felt that pinching side down in your kind of in your, not your stomach, but above your stomach, above your gut, if you will, it means you're out of shape, and that's because that muscle is getting tired. So we contract it, it flattens, it increases the volume, and air pressure from the outside pushes into our lungs. We don't really suck it in, it's pushed in. So if you go up high altitude where there's low air pressure, you can't breathe. So maximum tidal volume, the most volume of air that you can pull in is called your vital capacity. Swimmers, singers, people who do wind instruments, they understand this. And so you can increase that. The air left over after you blow everything out is your residual volume. I had a lab ready for that too, where we have all these airbags that we blow into, and it would have been fun. This is all controlled by pH. So CO2 in water lowers the pH, makes it more acidic. If you do wall sits and your muscles burn, that goes into your blood, makes it more acidic. Your brain monitors this like within 0.1, 0.2 on the pH scale. Homeostasis of blood pH is about 7.4 normally. If that gets down to 7.2, 7, 6.8, your heart rate and your breathing rate are both going to go up at the same time, because O2 raises the pH and brings it back to neutral. And so that's why you breathe faster when you work out or when you're stressed, is because your pH in your blood is going down, and your brain monitors that super carefully. So you have this, we'll talk about this when we do the nervous system. You've got several areas in the brain that monitor blood chemistry regularly, and they will talk to the heart, and they will control the diaphragm muscle, and your brain has to coordinate that at the same time. So who would have thought breathing would have been so difficult? So as CO2 level decreases, that means the pH is going back up to about 7.4, and everybody's happy, and the heart slows down, and your breathing slows down. And all of this comes back to what we talked about with primary, secondary, and tertiary folding of proteins to a famous protein known as hemoglobin. And we talked about this both in large macromolecules with how the proteins are made. They trap and hold that oxygen. And we even talked about this when we talked about genetics. But one of the cool things about lungs is now understood from the NIH is that lungs are primarily responsible for making hemoglobin, not your bone marrow. So no smoking, nothing like that to mess with your lungs, because they are a hemoglobin factory for your entire body, and they are the sensor, the measuring system of the environment. So no vaping, no smoking. They're only meant for O2 and CO2.